So let's talk about the most powerful Terminators in Warhammer 40k and what makes them so good. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Terminators, and in this video I thought we'd talk about some of the most powerful tactical dreadnought armour in the 41st millennium. Terminator armour or tactical dreadnought armour are certainly one of the coolest and most iconic things in the 40k setting. Basically a space marine decked out in enormous exo armour to the extent of being essentially a walking tank, usually blazing away with a bolt weapon on one hand and ready to smite the enemy in melee with a power weapon of some sort in the other. They're often deployed by teleport technology, and the armour also makes good use of force shielding with a bit of the Emperor's armour in their Crux Terminators, although the many Terminator formations that fell to the Heretic Astartes very much have their own way of doing things. In 10th edition they've had quite a lot of focus. The new sort of Primaris scaling ones for the core Space Marines were very well received indeed. I guess at some point they're gradually going to be redoing the rest of them to that kind of scale, though it'll probably be a very slow rollout. Games Workshop also seems to have had a habit of slashing the points cost on a whole bunch of Terminators since I last focused on them, and for this video I thought we'd talk through each faction's versions briefly, and then take a real focused look at the one that I really think has claim to fame as the single best Terminator variant in Warhammer 40k. Who I think quite comfortably wins at the moment, not by a small margin. For most Terminators though, I thought we'd talk through the different variants in sort of ascending power level, the ones that feel a bit mid for their codex, then moving on to the ones that are a bit stronger, before doing a proper focus on the scariest in 40k. First up, let's start out with the standard Terminators. The regular Terminator squad for Codex Space Marines is 170 points per 5, and they have the standard stat line for Tactical Dreadnought armour in 10th edition, toughness 5 with a 2+ save and 3 wounds, plus a 4+ invulnerable save that helps them out against high AP things. Generally it means that any Terminator out there is going to be at least somewhat hard to take down. They're not going to fall over to small arms fire particularly fast, so you need special or heavy weapons to lay them low. The standard Space Marine Terminators get Power Fists in melee, 3 attacks at Strength 8, AP 2 and Damage 2, a bunch of Stormbolter shots for clearing hordes, and then lightly supplementing all of that with a Cyclone Missile Launcher for a couple of slightly more powerful shots. Their special rules give them a Teleport Homer and a slightly boosted Oath of Moment with +1 to hit. Unfortunately, despite a number of points cuts, including most recently going down to 170 points, they still seem to be rated as kind of mid for the standard Astartes. Certainly not unusable, and maybe a little bit better in casual games where they're just a fairly easy to use unit with a bit of damage and defense, but they kind of rarely make it into competitive lists, besides maybe doing a few weird combos with things like enhancements, where you can have really quite a big spectacularly points heavy unit of them to make the most of those. Every so often I feel like I see someone doing the meme of the big infiltrating unit of Terminators in Vanguard Spearhead, putting a great big chunky unit in the midfield and daring the opponent to come closer. Besides these, they also have the variants of the Terminator Assault Squad for their Thunderhammers and +1 wound. The Space Wolves and Deathwing also have their own Terminator variants, with slightly shifted gear and special rules, but not really doing things too massively differently in my opinion. I think it would be nice to see the standard Space Marine Terminator squad being a little bit more scary on the board. They generally don't tend to get taken in competitive that much at the moment. Otherwise, for Terminators that are perhaps a bit more mid, the World Eaters ones don't generally tend to get that much play versus things like Scary 8-Bound and Khorne Berserkers and Angron himself. They follow the sort of Chaos Terminator standard weapons that they can get, having a set amount of Power Fists and Chain Fists they can take in a squad, and otherwise having accursed weapons, though these guys really can hit quite hard on the charge, getting +1 attack and strength and access to a bunch of the World Eater's Blessings of Khorne. And I think they might be a slightly underrated choice as a result. I've certainly seen people experiment with them, as between the World Eater's melee buffs they're still going to be pretty spectacularly devastating there, and then maybe a little bit more tanky compared with some of their other choices. In general though, it seems to be the going theory that you want more speed with things like 8-Bound, hurtling out of cover and then hitting the enemy spectacularly hard, as opposed to these guys trading off some speed and damage for a little bit more durability. For the Thousand Sons, the Scarab Occult Terminators are perhaps considered a little bit on the mid-side for them as well. It's still interesting that in any competitive list, they really don't seem to be taken all that much, despite first their points cost coming down really quite a long way from 215 points, and then a whole bunch of other Thousand Son things going up in cost. It still doesn't seem to have tipped the faction away from their more tried and tested focus on the Cabal points approach with lots of Sorcerers and Rubric Marines yet. I still think their datasheet does have some interest. Besides Magnus, they're the only mainline Thousand Sons unit that can fight at least somewhat hard in melee with those Prosperine Capeshes, and compared with a lot of Terminators, they're really quite a shooty variant, with the AP1 on the Combi Bolters, and Soul Reapers and Hellfire missiles thrown into them. Potentially they can make use of some fairly good shooting synergies if they want to. They are pretty tanky as well, with a -1 to wound, and often get lethal hits on the go as well from the Thousand Son Sorcerer that tends to lead them who can also mark an enemy unit for reroll 1s to hit against them. Still though, it seems that Thousand Sons armies much prefer to be running around with loads of Rubik Marines, Mutaliths, Chaff units, Sorcerers and Magnus, and as a result they're still not typically played very much in competitive lists. Before we move on to the upper echelons of Terminators out there in 40k, I'll just give a quick shout out to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain, one option for making a fun 40k battlefield and doing things quite differently to a bunch of other terrain makers out there, with a system of fold out pop-up cardboard terrain arranged in squares to make a 45 by 60 inch battlefield the right size for 40k. The advantage of having pop-up cardboard terrain is that it's ridiculously easy to store and transport. Each of their terrain sets basically comes in a box set the same size as a regular board game, so for some purposes when you want to take terrain round to someone's house or something, it could be really quite easy to pack away as opposed to other things such as plastic or other stuff. It certainly has its pros and cons versus other terrain sets out there, and I'll talk through a few of those at the end of the video, but it does seem to be a good solution enjoyed by a good chunk of people. I'll leave them linked in the video description if you'd like to check them out, and cycle back to them at the end of the video to talk through a few of their specific terrain sets and a bunch of the advantages and disadvantages of their sets. Moving up the fear factor for the Terminators though, next up we have the Allarus Custodians, the Terminator elite of the Emperor's Golden Legion. These guys are 195 points for 3 of them, and Custodians have the stats better than Terminators anyway, but these guys increase that to toughness 7 and 4 wounds, pretty much with the durability of walking tanks there. And for their weapons they have a bunch of volume fire with ballistic grenade launchers and guardian spear attacks, which make them not too bad at clearing hordes, with multiple copies of the blast attacks, and in melee they're lightly striking with guardian spears at strength 7 AP 2 damage 2, boosted by martial Qatar, and their Slayer of Tyrants rule, which gives them reroll wound rolls against character monsters and vehicle units. They also have their From Golden Light rule, giving them a once per game return to reserve so they can potentially deep strike elsewhere. It could be a way to get them up the board very quickly or reach other places for threatening isolated enemy units or doing objectives. Currently for their power in game, it seems that the meta for the Custodians is that in general blocks of Wardens with Blade Champions tend to be the mainstay on their battle line more so than these. They do have some nice advantages, but maybe their issue is their points cost for their defensive profile, which is still very good, but when it's going to be taking the beating of all the enemy's anti-tank, the cheaper Wardens with their wound roll debuff and their big turn of feel no pain seem to get the nod over these guys. I certainly still think that they're solidly very usable though. For the mainline Heretic Astartes, we've got the Chaos Terminator squad, 180 points per 5 of these guys. These ones are basically the dark mirror of the regular Loyalist ones, though they do have a fair amount of different war gear. They can only take a certain number of Power Fists and Chain Fists, then one can take it a paired Accursed weapon, and heavy weapons they can pack a Reaper autocannon. Compared with the regular Loyalist version, they get the very nice benefit of Dart Packs, which means that basically whenever they're shooting or fighting, they'll be able to get either sustained hits or lethal hits, which is really quite a big damage boost, and becomes even more so because whenever they get to make a Dart Patch, they also get to re-roll the hit roll as well, meaning that you've got a lot more chance of getting those lethal hits or sustained hits in the first place. In general, balance-wise, following their last points cut, Chaos Terminators do seem to be getting taken at least a little bit in Chaos Space Marine lists once more. It still seems that more people tend to be running Legionaries and Chosen in Rhinos as some of their primary Chaos damage combos, but I feel like these guys do have draw to them, potentially as a nice rapid ingress threat, or doing quite well in certain detachments that can give them buffed damage or speed, say Renegade Raiders, Pact Bound, or Veterans of the Long War maybe. Finally though, getting into Terminators that just feel outright strong for their factions right now. First up we have the Deathwing Knights. I feel like before their prior points increase they would have been vying for one of the very strongest Terminators in the game, and still probably are up there, but no longer feel quite as above the rest as they used to at 250 points versus 235. The Deathwing Knights do have stats to justify being some of the most expensive Terminators in 40k though. 4 wounds apiece with -1 damage means that damage 2 and damage 3 weapons just really aren't anywhere near as big a deal to them compared with other Terminators out there. It's going to take around about twice the amount of those attacks to kill one, and they've even got defense against mortal wounds with their Watcher in the Dark for a 4+ feel no pain against them once per game. Then on the damage front, they've got enough damage out of the squad to one round the majority of more normal sized Warhammer 40k units, particularly if they have some buffs coming from their detachment in one way or another. Usually a great weapon or flail on the Sergeant with the devastating wounds and sustained hits, and then either the mace or the power weapon with their buff profiles from the Summer Balance data slate, which is a big deal in turning them from being a somewhat underwhelming damage unit to a really quite scary one. Both of those profiles are really quite nice. Maybe the Mace of Absolution I think perhaps does the best in a vacuum, though the power weapon's quite nice if you've got +1 to wound from the detachment that they're running in some way. In any case, they still seem to be really quite strong for Dark Angels, being played in quite a lot of their top competitive lists. The Dark Angels as a whole aren't as strong as they used to be. Win rates towards the lower end of the 40k balance spectrum as opposed to the upper end now. I'm sure these Terminator nerfs having something to do with that. Finally, before we get on to the one that I'd rank top, we've got the Grey Knight Terminators. They've got the Brotherhood Terminator Squad and the Paladins, depending on whether you want more damage or defense. The Brotherhood Terminators are maybe more sort of the troop style equivalent with extra objective control, and they go in for more damage over defense. Lethal hits on the charge means that those strength 6 force weapons can punch off a bit better against tough stuff. Though they also get an apothecary in the unit, being able to revive a slain model from death each turn if the squad does wind up being depleted but not destroyed. The Paladins favour a bit more defense with a wound roll debuff special rule and hitting on a 2+ but no apothecary. Both are fairly usable and strong for the Grey Knights and often tend to be accompanying some of their scary characters. In particular, Caldor Drago pairs rather well with the standard Brotherhood Terminators. His strength 8 and damage 3 attacks work well with lethal hits. I'd certainly say they're a very solid unit, but maybe not just outright carrying the army all by themselves, usually tending to be fielded alongside a few power armoured variants and dreadnoughts to do the heavy lifting. At the moment though, the single Terminator variant that I rank as the strongest in Warhammer 40k though are the Deathshroud Terminators, the brooding elite of Mortarian's Legion, often serving as envoys for the Primarch himself, conveying his will to the lesser subordinates in a whispered hiss and fighting in complete silence, rather than the raucous battle cries of the other Space Marine legions. These guys are armed with the mighty Man Reapers to harvest the enemies of the Death Guard, and both have miniatures in Horus Heresy and more contemporary 40k, the latter being all a bit more blighted and Nurgle infested compared with the former. These guys were already a very solid and scary block of stats for 120 points, but went down to 110 points per 3 of them in the last balance update. That's one of the second times that for the Death Guard it's felt like Games Workshop were buffing the wrong Terminators, Deathshroud already being at least kind of popular, whereas their cousins the Blightlord Terminators just don't get as much of a look in. Given their terrifying nature, I thought we'd do a bit more of a focus on their datasheet. They're 110 points for 3 models, and compared with normal Terminators, as well as their massive stats, they do have the downside of having slower movement than most. Terminators are already a little bit on the slow side at 5-inch movement, but Deathshroud Terminators are some of the slowest moving models in the game. For a mainline damage and defense threat, only moving 4 inches at base. It means that with an average charge roll of 7 inches, they're only going to be getting charges on enemies at 11-inch range or so, which is quite a downside. I'll just go to some way to explaining why their stats are just so impressive versus their peers. Perhaps particularly with no access to advance and charge like a few of the other Space Marine Terminators out there can get from detachments. Slow movement definitely has its downsides, though if you're just wanting to march up to a mid-board objective and take it from the opponent, they can still certainly do that. And they do have deep strike, which means they could rapid ingress to get their melee exactly where it needs to be. A particularly nice way of delivering slow melee units to the fight. Basically both their damage and defense stats competes per point with just about any of the other Terminators out there. At 110 points, they're essentially around 37 points per miniature, and for that you get 3 wounds at toughness 6, with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, and when they have a character in the unit, they're -1 to wound as well, which is generally very helpful indeed against a lot of the stuff that's going to be best against them, things like special and heavy weapons with high AP and lots of damage. In general, characters aren't something you'd ever feel bad about leading them with, seeing as they've got multiple really good options. They might be able to get cover with their 2+ armour saves, which could ruin the day of lower AP things trying to destroy them. The characters give them extra durability buffs in melee as well, and depending on the contagion that you select, I feel like most of the time people might be going for the extra AP ones if they're fighting anything that's got meaningful armour saves. But if you went for the -1 to hit one, then it could make them yet more tanky if the enemy has to strike them up close. Their range damage isn't exactly the big thing with those Plague Spurt gauntlets, but it certainly can add a bit of horde clearance, which doesn't hurt for scary armoured elites. You get 1 Plague Spurt gauntlet on each guy, and then the champion gets 2. So for an 110 point unit of 3 of them, you've got 46 strength 3, AP 0 damage 1 shots with anti-infantry and ignores cover, usually killing around about 5 horde models or a single Space Marine, though they do get significantly better in contagion range. If you have that with the AP debuff against horde infantry, you'd be wounding them on 3s with a bit of AP, so you'd kill like 8 guardsmen or termagants or something. They could overwatch with those, given that they're torrent weapons, which could be a bad thing if any lighter infantry units want to move up and take their objective that they're trying to hold. They can fire them in melee as pistols to chip in a little bit of damage, though they would have to think a bit carefully about when they make use of them and when they don't, if they're trying to close distance on the enemy, given that they could have the chance to make their charge range longer. So there maybe is a bit of anti-synergy there with them not wanting to shoot their way out of melee. Then their melee damage though, again for the fairly cheap 37 points per model, really does feel next level. The Man Reapers do have a sweep mode, but against anything but the lightest infantry it makes sense to strike. 4 attacks each, hitting on 2s at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 with lethal hits. Their targets in melee will always be within contagion range for the -1 toughness, so they'll be wounding toughness 5 things on a 2, and it could matter against toughness 8 or 9, and often with extra AP if you're fighting against an opponent with meaningful armour saves. Just for a squad of 3 of these guys, and assuming the AP boost, you kill around about 10 guardsmen, 7 space marines, 2 terminators, or 8 wounds to a 3+ save vehicle. That's massively respectable numbers for a pretty durable 110 point unit, never mind the fact that you can easily take 6 of these and they might have a character on tow. After character buffs and things, they're going to do the best part of destroying a Titanic Knight in a single round of combat, though their profile is particularly nasty against elite infantry. For character support though, their options are also rather great. Maybe one of the most commonly taken things is the Death Guard Sorcerer and Terminator armour, 70 points for a cheap Terminator character, who'll add an extra body to the unit, striking with a Plague Fist that's a little bit weaker than the Man Reaper profile but not by crazy amounts, but realistically having its biggest thing being a massive range threat to the unit, blasting out a Curse of the Leper that on the first time it attacks will be strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3 with 2d6 attacks all the way out to 24 inches. That's just a pretty massive damage profile against anything that's sort of medium infantry focused, and they also have a melee debuff, which means that enemies fighting them in close combat will be hitting with -1 damage, absolutely ruining the day of anything that tries to kill them with damage 2 or damage 3 weapons. Those two things are pretty great for 70 points, adding another tough Terminator body to the unit with some alright melee attacks, and a model that's only 33 points above the cost of a regular Deathshroud. Typhus of course is also stand out absolutely wherever he is. He's 80 points for a massively punchy Lord of Contagion with strength 9 and damage 3 on his Man Reaper attacks, so helps out against the toughest stuff. He makes them -1 to hit in melee, though his other big value is just to throw out a whole bunch of mortal wounds against something within 18 inches. Kind of impossible to go wrong any way around, and Deathshroud are a perfectly reasonable place to put him. The damage 3 attacks are definitely a big deal against either big things with lots of wounds where he'll be wounding things like toughness 10 on a 4+, or enemy Terminator equivalents where he'll be slaying them with each attack. Then beyond character buffs, they can have rapid ingress to get them there as mentioned. They're a pretty good target for this, particularly given that they're a particularly durable unit, and that means that compared with some things at rapid ingress, you might be a little bit less stressed if a few things can shoot them. Unless the enemy puts a serious amount of firepower into them, they're probably not going to make the unit that much less scary, and that firepower might likely have been going away from other things. If they're moving up with the rest of a Death Guard army, they could threaten to heroic intervene, which could make them a lot more of a threat on mid-board objectives. Again, they've got the tankiness where they could step up to the fight, have the enemy hit them, and then just laugh it off and hit back hard. And then a whole bunch of the Death Guard stratagems work pretty great on them. 1 command point for extra AP in melee, 1 CP for sustained hits 1 or 2, the latter if you hold an effective objective marker, and they can also get a -1 damage in melee if they happen not to be led by a sorcerer, or potentially use a command point for stealth if they're going to be the focus of a lot of shooting. -1 to hit and wound is going to save a bunch of Terminators. Mortarion himself might also be able to help opportunistically as well, ignoring modifiers, granting cover, or giving you some reroll wound rolls. It could be a touch harder to coordinate with him than some. Between all this, even with their downsides, at the moment I would rate Deathshroud Terminators as the single most powerful Terminator squad in Warhammer 40k, at least when considering for leaders and waiting for points. When taking both of their damage and defense into the cost, I feel like for the points cost they basically sort of outfight and outdefense the vast majority of other Terminators, effectively having strength 8, AP 3 and damage 2 attacks with lethal hits. It's just horrendously general purpose, and then a solid toughness 6 stat line with -1 to wound if a character's about, and then really cheap and efficient characters with the Sorcerer and Typhus both being great for what they do and well worth including. As a result, they're certainly being run in really quite big numbers in competitive Death Guard lists right now. At least a few armies have been going for the full meme mode of running 18 of them on the board, just embracing the cheap Terminator stats to the absolute max, though it's a bit more common for numbers somewhere between 6 and 12 of them to be taken, and use them more of an element of the army, perhaps either focus on rapid ingress or dominating one objective marker, and perhaps seeing it that going too heavy on them could potentially have its downsides with their slow movement. I've seen most people going for squads of 6 with a character attached. There are definitely a bunch of people run them in 3s as well. I feel like they're never really going to be a terrible choice in just about any form right now. Perhaps particularly at a more casual level versus competitive, where enemy lists just might not have the raw stats to be able to take them on properly, or tend to play quite as smart with trying to screen or limit them. They definitely do have weaknesses with their slow movement. I feel like if you do have entire massive squadrons of them on the board, you might raise the chance of the opponent being able to do something all very clever with screening or move blocking them with expendable units, or deciding to go for a bit of defeat in detail, and basically allowing one Deathshroud Terminator squad just to be completely ignored, and then focusing everything on one where you want to try and take the objective from them. But even with these downsides, I feel like you can make the opponent have tough decisions with them. Provided they're stomping up and taking on objective markers, the opponent's likely going to be giving up points things if they are ever choosing to ignore them. And for the efficient points they are, that doesn't really feel like the worst. In any case, there certainly seems to be a good reason why Death Guard are doing rather great in tournament stats at the moment. Most of their units are really quite viable, Mortarion and Plague Marines and various armour things in addition to these guys. Nurgle seems to be having a rather good time of it, though unfortunately the Blight Lord Terminators still seem to be getting left on the shelf. In any case, let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. What would you rate as 40K's strongest Terminators right now? And would you agree or disagree that they're the Deathshroud? Look forward to hearing your thoughts. Finally, I'll just cycle back to today's video sponsor in Titan's Terrain. As mentioned earlier, foldable cardboard pop-up terrain for your battlefield. I'll just talk through a few of their pros and cons and their specific terrain sets. There's lots of good options for getting 40k terrain on the table out there, and the Titan's foldable cardboard stuff is a bit different to the rest. As mentioned earlier, probably the biggest selling points for it is that it's really easy to store and transport, given that you literally just fold each square in half and put it in essentially a board game box. So it can be handy for those of you out there where space is an issue and you don't have enough room to warehouse a table's worth of terrain in your home, or you might struggle to transport it in addition to an army. It's also far cheaper than a whole board of Games Workshop terrain would cost, though you could say that on most terrain offerings it's at least somewhat comparable to MDF. And another fairly nice selling point is that it doesn't need painting or assembly or anything, it's all ready to go and deploy immediately as soon as you get some, which I think does have appeal for those who don't want to spend a long time hobbying and crafting their own custom terrain and they just want something out of the box. For potential drawbacks and downsides, it is generally seen as being a bit less sturdy and hard wearing versus plastic or MDF stuff, given that it is made of cardboard and designed to fold flat. It does mean that you'd have to look after it and treat it well, and due to the nature of the cardboard constructions, it can be a bit tricky to put models in upper floors and things, and typically it makes a bit more sense if you're playing with models down on the tabletop. Maybe the other downside is the grid layout of it, offering a bit less flexibility than some more freeform bits of terrain, and maybe can create some firing lanes in 40k that aren't the best. You can at least get a fair amount of variation by rotating the different tiles and having the buildings orientated in different directions or different layouts, plus perhaps putting on an extra terrain piece or two just freestanding, maybe to break up the worst firing lane or two. It also doesn't really make tournament approved layouts if that's what you're looking for, but I feel like I've heard enough anecdotes of it being solid enough terrain for casual gaming. In any case, for their specific sets, they've got 3 main ones, a Forgotten Furnace one which is an all very heretical Forge Planet type thing, lots of furnaces and foundries and glowing runes and things, and the normal price for these is £112, $140 or €130. They've got a more standard Ruined City one called the Shattered Hive. This one a whole bunch of collapsed ruined buildings, armoured containers and things like that. They've also got a terrain set really quite similar to the Shattered Hive one called Overgrown Capital with a bit of a different skin on it, looking a lot more verdant and more fantasy themed. Could be an appropriate terrain set that could work both for more fantasy setting games or grimdark future-y type ones. Then finally, each one of those has an expansion centerpiece set, a great big building that's created by putting 2 tiles together, which does cost a bit extra, but if you wanted a centerpiece bit for it, it could be fun. The city one and the capital one have a great big cathedral type construction, and the foundry has an infernal spire. In any case, thanks to them for sponsoring the video, and feel free to check them out, links in the video description if you're interested in some foldable terrain. In any case, I'll leave that there for this one. Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below on the Terminators and things, and feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics if you'd like to see more like this. Feel free to check out the other links down in the video description as well. There's the one to the channel's Patreon page, and discount links for buying 40k models if you are picking something up. All those help to support the channel, but otherwise I'll leave this one there. A massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.